Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seat. The session will start in a few minutes.
Thanks, man.
Grazie.
Hot water. Yay. Grazie.
Thanks.
But we have glasses.
Thank you.
It's a luxury.
Okay. Never mind. Wet panel, lucky panel. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrea Cellino. I'm the head of the North Africa desk at DCAF, which is the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. And I'm here to moderate this panel this afternoon, which is supposed to provide the opportunity to discuss the main challenges related to security sector governance in the MENA region by drawing upon the key findings of this report, Institutionalized Insecurity, exploring the MENA region's governance crisis, which you can pick up upstairs, and jointly published by ISPI and DCAF. Before we get into the discussions, I would like to thank warmly ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation for hosting us in this context and giving us the opportunity to have this discussion. To get immediately into our subject matter, the report found, among other elements, that in the region's post-conflict environments, and there are a few, progressively weakened institutions struggle to operate and deliver effective security services. More specifically, in many countries affected by war or insecurity or social political instability, the widening governance deficit in the security realm often stems from structural lack of transparency and accountability, or an insufficient capacity to meet communities' needs and expectations safely. In such context, in addition, hybrid and/or non-state actors are often able to fill the gap, fill the vacuum in the security sector with significant repercussions on the nature and functioning of security institutions and security itself. Today, the goal of this panel will be to highlight these issues and have a discussion regarding their implications in the MENA region. And we are very fortunate to have a distinguished panel, which I will briefly introduce. At my left, we have Benedetta Berti, who is the head policy planning in the office of the NATO Secretary General. Natalina Cea, to my left, who is the head of mission of UBAM, the European Union Border Assistance Mission in Libya. Ranj Al-Aldin, to my far left, who is a non-resident fellow, Brookings Institution, and director of the Carnegie Corporation's Crisis Response Council. And last but not least, at my far right, Emadeddine Badi, who is advisor for Libya for DCAF and several other things, but he's a renowned expert on Libya. As a sort of a technical information, I will ask one first round of questions to each of the panelists, who will have 5 minutes to reply, and if they are, generous with their time, we will have, and that's my goal, a second round of questions for each of them. So I will start with Benedetta. NATO has been for many years engaged in the MENA region with initiatives such as the Mediterranean Dialogue and ICI, the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. And in the region, many traditional security orders, as the report found, have turned into hybrid ones, where the line between state and non-state actors and institution has become blurred. And formal and informal security actors have developed complex relationship. So I would like to hear from you how this phenomenon has impacted NATO approach in the region, and in particular, what implications for the alliances, strategy and approach to SSR and SSG.
Great.
Please, Benedetta.
Thank you. And I will try to be as disciplined as possible and stick with my 5 minutes. So to do so, I think the best way is for me to start with a caveat and say, I'm going to actually engage with this question, and that means I'm not going to speak in an institutional capacity. I'm going to give you my 2 cents.
Okay.
Because I think that's going to make it a little bit more animated. And I'm also going to broaden the aperture just a little bit, in the sense that what I see is that the struggles that we have when it comes to security sector reform and security assistance more large, yes, we have them as NATO, but we have them also as bilaterally, so as individual countries, and more widely, it's something the international community as a whole struggles with. So I think the dilemmas I'm going to talk about are applicable to a number of organizations. And of course, when I say the international community, what I'm really talking about is mostly European, North American, political West approaches. If we were here to discuss how Iran built militias, we would be having a very different conversation. So I will just clarify what I mean by international community. But it seems to me that, and this is why this report is so well done and interesting, that you have literally hit the jackpot. What we have, I think, in our approach to post-conflict stabilization, including security sector reform, but not limited to it, is we're still hung up by, I would call it, our end of history paradigm, meaning that we say we don't believe in it, but in reality, the way we build most of our programs is based on the assumption that there is a problem. The problem is the lack of order. In order to fix the problem, you need a solution. That solution is the state. And you want to build if you want to build a stable, secure, well-governed territory, you invest in building state capacity. That's mostly how most of our programs work. And when I mean state, it's also a particular model. It's the democratic, liberal, internationally integrated type of state. That's the aspiration. That's how we build our programs. And that translates into our approach to SSR, which means to solve a problem like provision of security. We want to invest in national security forces. We want to build a centralized system, strong command and control, and that's going to be eventually the main actor responsible for providing security. Now, there is nothing wrong on a theoretical level with this construct. In fact, it is part of the solution. But there is also some problems with it, and I would say that the main problem is that, as your report rightly underlines, it clashes with reality. Most of the world, and I would say the only item I want to not take issue but slightly contextualize is this is not a new phenomenon. In most of the world, for most of history, provision of security is done by multiple actors. The monopoly over the use of force, the Weberian state, it's the exception, it's not the rule. So there is a clash between the way we want to see security and the way security is implemented on the ground. It's implemented in most countries, the reality is if we count the countries on the map and we see who provides security and justice, in most countries these are mediated orders. The state is one actor, but it's just one of many. And sometimes the state derogates actively provision of security, and some other times it doesn't derogate. It simply doesn't have the bandwidth to fulfill this obligation. So the main problem we have is that our conceptual model doesn't really describe the reality we deal with, and I would say this is this is also true in the Middle East and North Africa. But I would also say this is not just because we're naive or are not aware. I think maybe in some cases we might be, but I think by and large it's because states work through states. That's the way we're programmed to work. So it's not just that we don't understand, it's the tools and the concepts we have are not 100% fitted with reality. But the answer to these tensions, and I know I have very little time, so I'm simplifying a lot, but just to make some points. The problem is awareness is a good step, but by itself doesn't provide an easy solution because there are still great dilemmas. One dilemma is, as an international actor, under international law, you work with the state. If you actually want to work with non-statutory actors without the consent of the state, well, that's not that is a political decision that carries deep political consequences, from recognition to weakening of the state potentially. It may be that in some cases that is warranted, but there is a tension between legitimacy on the ground and international legitimacy, which is awarded only to states. So that's one problem. The other problem is that because we have this understanding of how you build capacity and security through state-based provision, we have made security sector reform and security assistance very technical. And that's not a bad thing in per se, but the reality is that there is nothing, especially in a post-conflict society, there is nothing as political as providing justice and security. It's a way of ordering. It is a way to increase political capital. So again, technical approach versus political problem, tension. I realize I'm not giving you a lot of solutions, I'm giving you a lot of problems. Mm-hmm. But I'll close with this because I don't want to take, I want to be sticking to the time. How do we move forward? I think it's quite, and I'll put on an academic hat for a second, so I'll give you a solution that is very good, but really not feasible. But that's the beauty of academia. So the beauty would be that we are able to decouple, in a way, the functional and the structural, meaning that we look at provision of security not as a function. Legitimacy is not a function of statehood or stateness. Legitimacy is a function of output-oriented legitimacy, which means you are a legitimate security provider if you can provide security, if you can do it in a way that is transparent, if you are perceived as legitimate by the community you are providing security for. Think of the many examples. And if you engage in non-predatory practices, so if it's not a profit-driven provision of security, I'm giving you a few criteria. I could come up with 20 more, but the point is, if there was a possibility politically to be more determined in looking at the functions as opposed as the labels, probably we would have a better way forward. But then again, this is my 5 minutes of pretending I don't work in the real world, because that is much harder to do in reality. We have international law, we have internal controls and procedures. It's very nice to say, it's very, very hard to do, but maybe that's my introduction.
Thank you very much, Benedetta. And perhaps in the second part, we can come back to how this reality which you have described is going to reflect in NATO's internal workings and policy making. So now I would like to move to Natalina and move also to a more field-centered area and ask you, we heard in a previous session how SSR is a central, SSR and DDR are central elements in the stabilization of Libya, and I'm sure we'll hear more also from Emad. But as a technical mission operating in such a volatile political environment as the Libya one, in what way are you able to play a role to define common approaches, in particular in programming SSR and DDR, and also how is that affecting, for instance, a key problem, the ongoing efforts to interfere with the situation in Libya by other actors, which are not necessarily members of the EU?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I just want to give you some information concerning the mission so you can better understand our role. So UBAM was established in 2013 as a tool of the European Common and Security and Defense Policy. The main mandate of the mission, so the main objectives, is to support the Libyan authorities in building a security structure, mainly related to border, in order to disrupt the illegal trafficking and criminal trafficking that are interesting the country. Unfortunately, due to the instability of the country, the mission was relocated to Tunis for some years. But now we are back, and I hope that we can stay and support the Libyan authorities in their process through a real exercise, SSR. I have to say that we are at the beginning of the SSR process, mainly, as I said, due to the different attempts in the past, but unfortunately it was not possible to conclude, even, for example, with our main mandate that is on border. So how the mission, as technical mission, as you rightly said, can support the process. We are, as I said before, the main counterpart on border. On border, we have worked with all the Libyan agencies, and particularly with the national team for border and security. And in this framework, we started, I have to say, started and concluded in 2020 a good SSR exercise that was conducted to the drafting of an integrated border management strategy. It's called the so-called white paper. that is based on different layers, of course, as all the SSR process. It's linked to the governance, to defining what is the governance for the internal, and you know that in the IBM there are also external and interagency cooperation, very important for this. So defining what is the internal and external level of cooperation. Legislation, because as you can imagine, due to the different approach on the legislation, there are some overlappings of competencies, responsibilities, and controls. And of course, there is the part related to human resources, related to the internal organization and instructions. So it's a full package that was approved in end of 2019 by the national team. That was, as I said, we were supporting them in drafting this comprehensive reform. The reform is under the approval. We hope that the government will approve this reform as soon as possible in a way that we can start even for some components of the strategy, the related implementation. I have to say that I arrived in February, and after my arrival, we had the new unity government, which of course was facing different urgent problems, mainly linked to the reunification of the forces. And of course, this is also touching part of the mandate of the mission, which is related to the border agencies. And so we are now in the phase of supporting on bilateral level the different agencies. There is the border guard, for example, that is responsible for the surveillance of the border and for the security as well. Then we have what is really called the border management, which is immigration, customs, phytosanitary, veterinary, and so on. And all these we are now approaching with in the framework of the reform that was actually endorsed by the National Team for Border, but more on bilateral level in order to support them in this transition period that should lead to the final reunification of the chain of command. That is very important.
Thank you. Perhaps afterwards we can have a look, or you can tell us more about the challenges in operating this reunification and how you deal with hybrid forces and groups. Now I would like to move to Ranj and remain on the issue of hybridity, which, as you know and you correctly describe in your contribution to the volume, is characterized by the coexistence of formal and informal actors. And in that context, the lack of accountability is often one of the major challenges that conventional long-term approaches to SSR struggle to tackle. So perhaps you can tell us, in your view, what are the main dynamics affecting accountability in hybrid security orders, and which obstacles are normally encountered by authorities and also external stakeholders in many cases in focusing on this issue of accountability.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Huge thanks to ISPI and DCAF for putting this panel together, and of course the publication. It was an honor to be a part of the volume. I mean, I think the first starting point is to start with the numbers, because the numbers don't lie. So by estimates from various institutions, there's around 300,000 to 400,000 approximately armed groups, or fighters rather, that don't answer to centralized authorities, that instead answer to political parties, tribes, socio-political movements, essentially authorities that have, let's say, very limited regard for so-called state structures and limited regard or limited ties to centralized systems. Secondly, these are actors that have their own, let's say, financial streams. They're very capable of self-sustaining themselves. So in Iraq, for example, you've got around $10 billion per year lost to illicit cross-border trade. And that tells you that these actors are very resilient and they have, let's say, very limited constraints, both domestically but also externally. Third, there's ample space for these groups to recruit fighters. So the MENA region has, I believe, the highest youth unemployment in the region. It stands at around 27 to 28% at the moment. And fundamentally, over the next 5 years, 101 million people could be classed as impoverished. And those are very worrying numbers that tell you a lot about the longevity of the hybrid security order. It's self-sustaining, it's very resilient, and in my opinion, it's not going to be repaired anytime soon. But I would add to that and say, actually, we should no longer think of hybrid security orders as problems, but a reality. And I think that's the first step to, let's say, formulating some of the policies that Benedetta recommended or alluded to. And here's where I think the main challenges come in place for people like yourself who are actually responsible for implementing the policies. And I sympathize with you, because whilst we talk about structural wholesale changes within the MENA system more generally, I believe the wholesale structural changes need to take place in London, in Washington, in Rome, in Berlin, in Paris, because institutionally, these are capitals that do not have the necessary infrastructure or institutions to deal with hybrid security orders. And that's in stark contrast to, let's say, some regional actors. There's no point naming them because it's quite obvious who they are. They are very well positioned, institutionally speaking, but also politically speaking, to manage to shape these hybrid security orders. So what to do about the problem, coming to the solutions? Firstly, I say reformulate it into a public policy question. And I come back here to the point about the corruption that takes place in general, but also at the border points, coming back to the $10 billion figure. And I shudder to think what the figures are in Libya. A public policy approach means diminishing the space within which the most dominant armed non-state actors can accrue financial resources, both outside of the state and within the state, bearing in mind that they control, dominate, or influence both formal and informal economies. Secondly, mediation. I think there's a lot of space, and again, Libya provides a good example of that. Yemen has some more limited constraints in that sense, but still some success stories. Syria is perhaps the most disappointing. Iraq has had 10 to 15 years of very positive mediation success stories. Because I think on that front, the West in particular has more flexibility and is more dynamic in trying to reconcile differences and shape, let's say, the post-conflict settlements that are so essential to SSR or DDR. But the problem here is conflicts generally tend to relapse. So there's, in all likelihood, around a 70 to 80% chance that once a conflict has ended, not necessarily in the MENA region, this could be applied to other conflict zones, they have a 70 to 80% chance of erupting again. So that tells you there's a very limited window of opportunity that should be capitalized on as and when they emerge. But this comes back to the crux of the issue, as in whether the West in particular is positioned to take advantage of these windows of opportunities. Right now, I don't think it is. Instead, it's more opportunistic, it's more ad hoc. Secondly, I think we need to start thinking about the different armed non-state actors and classifying them into different tiers. So you've got groups that are very ideologically driven and that can't be reconciled, that are less willing to compromise. Those who are more pragmatic, more opportunistic, those can be reconciled with. And then you've got those actors that, in fact, are determined to adhere to international norms because they see their future within the international state system. And in this particular instance, the most, let's say, the strongest example will be that of the Kurds, who over the past 10 to 15 years have tried with some success, but with a lot of setbacks as well, to try and reconcile themselves and adapt to the international order, its norms, and so forth. Now, when you package those things together with one eye on the reality of the hybrid security order, baby steps, incremental steps are fundamental. I don't think SSR and DDR are capable as of yet to manage this incremental approach to reforming the security sector in these various post-conflict transitioning societies, I would add. But crucially, regional actors. So these are processes and exercises that have to be undertaken firstly by local populations themselves, and secondly, there has to be some sort of collective approach. I'm not a big fan of the whole regional security architecture notion as being so fundamental to peace and stability in the region. I think that's far more ambitious, far too ambitious. And in the contribution to the volume, I've set out an argument for why we should start small and local. And here's where the question of civil society comes in. Here's where the work of empowering the judiciary, police forces, and so forth. So a very comprehensive, holistic approach with a strong emphasis on sequencing, but also taking advantage of those episodic moments of opportunity that arise and being able to capitalize on them. But the question here is, do you start at home in Western capitals, or do you go back to the basics on the ground in these transitioning post-conflict societies?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. You covered a lot of ground, Ranj, and that gives me also elements to continue our discussion with the other panelists. But now I would like to give the floor to Ahmad, and with a question on state capacity, which is, it has already been mentioned that state capacity has witnessed a substantial decline in the last 10 years. And concepts such as centralized authority, the state monopoly of violence, was already mentioned also by Benedetta, are increasingly challenged. And so, in your view, what is the relation between fragility and hybridity? And how does this interaction affect governance, particularly in the security realm?
Complicated to unpack there. I think it was a very bad decision to actually go last because my colleagues touched on a lot of these issues. But I'll try and maybe build on your interventions and mention a few things also that we tackle in the chapter in my contribution along with my colleague Roberta. I think one of the issues that we sometimes fail to acknowledge is that the existence of hybrid security orders is not exactly new. Even the authoritarians that were overthrown in 2011, a lot of them, and some which are still there today, operate through hybrid security orders. I think what happened is maybe, first of all, a devolution in these monopolies on violence, so everything is far more local. So I agree with Ranj about that being technically the starting point for things. So that's one. But then also the sense that prevailed during those quite long eras, I would say, of civil-military dislocation, these relationships that were not there, and ultimately also state-society relationships, which were effectively completely, I would say, destroyed in 2011 in a lot of these states. I'll speak at least in Libya right now, when you're looking for security provision, and this includes security, but also includes a lot of other things, you're not necessarily looking at the state to provide that to you. You're looking either to your, depending on how socially embedded, let's say, you are, how wide of a social network you have, you're looking at your community, your family, or sometimes you even take it upon yourself to take a weapon and actually provide yourself with the service that you view that you need. So it's not exactly like the state is as relevant a player as it is before. But then again, you can't throw the baby with the bathwater, and we can't say that the state is not relevant, because in a lot of cases, we're dealing with centralized states, and at least the infrastructure that exists in a lot of these countries is based on, let's say, a transactional relationship, and that's part of the reason why a lot of these armed groups exist at this nexus between state and non-state. It's not a relationship that is purely economic, again, but part of it is based on that. And I think also that the challenges that UBAM, for instance, faces is that you're dealing with a centralized state and trying to enforce, let's say, or improve management or security provision at a border, which is inherently more difficult than doing it, for instance, in an urban center where you have higher population density, etc. So there, maybe that's one of the facets, I would say, of institutional, like the relationship between hybridity and institutional fragility. The other facet of things is obviously all of the events that happened in the past 10 years have not unfolded in a vacuum. And the sovereignty or monopoly on violence that existed in a lot of the countries that we mentioned in this volume were sustained not by institutional architectures, but by personas. And the fact that a lot of these personas have are either gone, died, or have taken quite a hit and are a lot more dependent, I would say, on foreign actors nowadays. That means that the relationship, let's say, between them and sovereignty, they're not able to inoculate their countries anymore from foreign interventionism. And that's a thing that I think SSR thematically, or security sector reform and security sector governance thematically, is not very, has not been very proactive at tackling, partly because they involve a geopolitical discussion that we are sometimes not ready to have. And aside, let's say, the global disillusionment with liberalism, with globalization, with these ideals, you had very real security threats emerging concomitantly. So things like terrorism, things like transnational organized crime, drug trafficking, and also geopolitical jockeying between states bilaterally. And that was conducive, in addition to the, let's call it the disillusionment that I mentioned, to programs that are sometimes portrayed as security sector reform, but are merely, from my view at least, train and equip, basically, program where it's particular actors, if not individuals, that you are relying on, or networks at best, in these countries, that foreign states have effectively either sponsored, equipped, sometimes with weapons, or, and trying to secure interests that I would say are not necessary. It's not institution building. A lot of states, for instance, in the Libyan case right now, wonder whether XYZ actor is going to be able to reform the security sector, given the fact that many multilateral instruments have failed over the past 10 years. And I would say that this is a conversation that is relevant for a lot of other countries. I think that that's, if you look at how that support or capacity building is being deployed, it's not conducive to institution or state building. It's more of a ad hoc effort that is based around train and equip. And we shouldn't say that that's not, I don't need to say that this is not an important, let's say, development. It is one, because, and these networks have proven to be quite resilient in certain cases, and have proven to, at least for instance in the Iranian case, in the Iraqi case, etc., they've proven to be quite resilient even when political changes have occurred at the highest level of leadership within the state. So you clearly see that this model is there to endure, and that's part of the reason why I think that going local rather than multilateral and regional is far better a decision, let's say, pragmatically speaking. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mad. A lot of food for thought, and I have to congratulate the panelists because you've been using your time very well. So we still have about 20 minutes before the end. So there's plenty of time for a second round. And I would like to start again with Benedetta and go back to focusing on the role of international institutions. Perhaps you want to start with NATO or enlarge, because if, as we heard from Ranj, a policy shift is going towards small and local, at least as a start, what role is there for international, particularly Western institutions, especially because we need to consider the increasing amount of bilateral security assistance and so-called train and equip programs which have been undertaken by other actors, some of them NATO countries bilaterally, but others not NATO countries. And so perhaps you want to elaborate a little bit more from that perspective, starting obviously from your familiar ground, which is the alliance.
Certainly, and I know this time around I have even less time, so I'll go straight to the matter, and I will go to NATO this time. I will not dodge. But I will slightly flip and say, from a NATO perspective, and I think that's important to answer your question directly, is that of course we understand the security environment is complex, it's diffuse. A lot of the threats and challenges we face are transnational. They're not bound by geography. And therefore, why am I saying all this? I'm saying all this because working with partners, and in this case, partners from the other side of the Mediterranean, is for us a strategic interest. So I start from that. This is not a one-way street. Working with partners in the Middle East and North Africa through our Mediterranean dialogue and through the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, which are our two main channels to work with partners in the Middle East and North Africa, are first of all something that we need to do because it's in our interest, it's good for our security. We have a clear mission, which is security and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area. In a world of transnational threats, you can't do that in a vacuum. So first, it matters to us. So how do we do it? I think one of the important, and I'll massive room for improvement and evolution, as I said in my first round. But of course, to quote my fellow panelists, we're not throwing the baby away with the bathwater. Doing security sector reform done right with our partners is a way to contribute to stabilization. With one caveat, I think a major caveat, that security sector assistance and therefore the work we do by itself, it's not going to lead to stabilization if it's not backed by a whole of the international community approach. Without development, without reconstruction, without mediation, without political reform, we will do a really good job at the security sector piece, but it's not enough. So that's really important. Then how do we do the security sector piece? We work with our partners in the region. It is a mutual exchange. We work on areas that are mutual interest, from countering IEDs to countering terrorism to stopping the smuggling of small arms and light weapons. But we take a broad approach to security, which means that to us, security sector assistance, it's not just about the technical exercises, but it's also about civil military control. It's about building integrity, which is addressing corruption in the armed forces. It's about embedding gender perspective, human security. So there is, and I'm saying this because it's perhaps something that may appear, not everyone knows that, let's put it that way. But we do take a broad approach, but at the same time, and I think that's important, and for 2 minutes I'll stop here, it's also important to be humble and to know that security is important. Security is essential. Security is not sufficient to build stability. And I think that's a lesson not just for NATO, but for the whole international community. And where are we? And therefore, we work bilaterally with many of our partners, from Jordan to Morocco. And we have one train and assist and advise mission in Iraq. I say train and assist and train, advise and assist, not train and equip. That's not what NATO does. We don't do train and equip as an organization. I'll stop here because 2 minutes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Sorry, my reference to train and equip was to other actors.
No, just to
certainly not to NATO. But anyway, thank you very much. I would like to move again and zoom in again to Libya and go back to your comments regarding the reunification of border control forces, which is a major challenge as we understand. But how can you relate that to what Ranj indicated could be a strategy, starting low and small and local, and how would you, within that strategy, address the problem of hybrid forces who are effectively doing border control or doing not controlling the borders or or benefited from the lack of it?
Thank you. So first, to reply to your last question, I would say that we should recognize that there is a big difference in Libya between the north and the south. The south, the presence of the state in the south, including the border agencies, is very limited. So, of course, in this part of the country, there are a proliferation of illicit trafficking, illegal immigration, and so on. And so a particular attention should be put on this part of the countries, which is different from the implementation of a strategy for integrated border management that can be, for example, implemented where there are official crossing border points recognized by the two states, for example, the border between Tunisia and Libya. There you can do something really based on integrated border management, interagency, international cooperation with other parts. This is not possible in the south. So the south is completely different situation and need a completely different approach. So this should be clear, and it's very clear to our Libyan counterparts, which in all the occasions they are underlining the need to receive support for the South, both in terms of border management, but also in terms of reintegration of the, we can say, the young, we can say, that are now recruited by the criminal gangs, and then in the future can be reintegrated in the economic and social activities. Then I would like to mention two cases or example in which the EU and associated with the UBAM, but practically is the EU that is dealing with this, and we are, as the technical mission, we are supporting them. The first one is the joint police force that is monitoring the ceasefire agreement. You know that in the ceasefire agreement there is a monitoring made by international that provided by UN, and then there is a joint police force created by Libyans, with Libyans officers. And now we are supporting in this. The EU is supporting for the part of funding the training and also some capacity building and infrastructure for this joint police. But what we are doing is to supporting the Ministry of Interior in designing the concept of operation for this joint police. We have 200 policemen from the west, 200 from the east. You can imagine it's a big, we can say, big sign of reunification under one chain of command, the chain of command currently of the 5+5 committee. But in the future, this could be considered as a core of the national police of Libya. Yeah. And so EU is of course investing on this. This is the first example.
Thank you.
And do you want to that I will elaborate on the second?
Yes.
The second is related to the mercenaries. The 5+5, they have presented this plan for the withdraw the mercenaries from Libya. They would like to start from the country, from the Sahel, and they have requested the support of the EU. We have a joint coordination forum within the common security and defense policy. We have missions like the one in UBAM, in Libya that are working in Mali, in Niger, in Chad through the regional coordination cell. So in this forum, we are trying also to address this problem and what can be a possible support for DDR for the mercenaries in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there is perhaps some scope for go back to these points with Ahmad in the end. But first of all, I would like to turn to Ranj to go a little bit more in 2 minutes, 4 minutes, let's say. You could say a little bit more about the shift of policy which you hinted at in your first reply, and particularly the fact of how we go about identifying pragmatic actors. Also, you mentioned the role of civil society. Can you add a little bit more on that? Because certainly in some of the countries affected or post-conflict countries, it's a bit tricky to talk about the role of civil society. Ranj.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I would say, first of all, for every headline which highlights some awful event, there's probably 4 or 5 other headlines that are actually rather positive, but which don't get the attention. So the success stories, in fact, get very limited coverage in newspapers, in the media, and so forth. So I think that could be a very useful starting point where we perhaps highlight the success stories and learn from them. So there was a panel on Libya earlier with Stephanie, the former special envoy to Libya. And she departed from her previous post with a very successful mediation exercise, paving the way for the forthcoming elections. I think that could be a useful example to look at a bit more closely and dissect some of the fundamental lessons, but also perhaps areas where things could be improved on, number one. But secondly, I think it's critical to think of civil society. Civil society's strength is also its weakness. It's comprised of disparate actors. There isn't one single actor called civil society. And personally, I think that's a good thing in the sense that the more, let's say, disconnected they are, this patchwork of civil society actors across the region, the more difficult it is for the militias, the gangs and criminal enterprises to instrumentalize them, to co-opt them. So what happens often is these actors actually end up setting up their own NGOs, or think tanks even, and use this as a medium through which to generate resources, to generate legitimacy and credibility as well at the same time. However, on the flip side, civil society is, again, Iraq would be a very useful example, making the transition to political actors. So the protest movement in Iraq recently in the elections managed to secure, I believe, around 10 seats or so. That's quite remarkable since in the run-up to these elections, activists were being assassinated in droves, assassinated or tortured or kidnapped and so forth. And then there was a marked decline in the number of assassinations. And there's a fundamental lesson there in that if militias and other groups could kill 100 activists a day, they would. So we have to really ask why it is that they're not killing activists, civilians with carte blanche. And the reason is because you've got a number of different factors that combine to constrain the space in which these actors operate. That's of course also international condemnation, international pressure. A lot of these groups still see their future within the state and are trying to entrench themselves within those formal governing structures. However, there's also those actors that know they can have the best of both worlds, operate with autonomy, but at the same time extract resources from the state, generate credibility and legitimacy from the state. And those are the actors that have to be targeted, in my opinion, whether it's through sanctions or other punitive measures. We haven't discussed coercive diplomacy and the use of force potentially in these contexts, something which we dismiss too often and for which there is limited political will. In the 1 minute that I have left, I'll come back to the notion of accountability by just saying that we should no longer think of the judiciary, for example, as being the only conduit through which accountability can be achieved. In a lot of these countries, accountability is achieved through the tribes, through very informal, social, tribal structures, because people have no faith in the judiciary, have no faith in the police. So restoring public trust in these institutions could be a very useful starting point. And I will just say finally that in my opinion, elections too often get dismissed as a potential, let's say, accountability exercise, or as window dressing. We're hearing this in relation to Libya quite often. But in fact, elections can be very effective in restoring public trust, but also for the public to send a message to the political parties and to the elites. But for that, they need outside assistance, organization, discipline, and in some cases, funding.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And Emad, you have the challenging privilege of having to say some final words before we wrap up this panel. I would like to ask you if you can, drawing on your experience, in particularly in Libya, but also on your work on hybrid security in the last couple of years with us, if you can draw some lessons also based on what you heard on this panel.
Okay, well, I took a few notes just listening to my colleagues, and I'd like to commend them for their excellent intervention. One thing maybe that I was struck by listening to a few things about security sector reform and hybrid security, and also work on transnational flows. If I tell you, for instance, that the North African Sahel has the highest magnitude of illicit and licit transnational flows, it has very different implications security-wise in terms of your programming and understanding of things than if I tell you that it's the most informally, economically integrated place. It might mean the same thing if you look at it pragmatically, but from a programmatic standpoint, it means starkly different things. And for the communities, it is perceived very differently as well, unfortunately. So there's a disparity there that I think needs to be addressed in terms of how we view things, particularly at border areas in terms of security sector reform, which I think is an area where the modalities of reform are underappreciated, and how it should be done is underappreciated, because it should be far more locally led, considering how long these communities have relied on trans-border flows for really livelihood almost. Second thing is and this is as applicable to security sector interventions as it is to the political process, for instance, in Libya, is that you have this debate between what's pragmatic and what's ideal, and what's ideal becomes somehow the tenet of your process, even though you know that that is an ideal that you won't reach. And this is applicable sometimes to, like, for instance, the idea of the elections right now is considered an ideal situation, and there are a lot of ideal scenarios built on the hopes of that, what that would achieve. And the same thing is applicable to the security track, where we're talking about military unification, for instance, without addressing what the civilian, let's say, what the relationship of the military is civilian rule. And that's the starting point or the tenet of the security sector reform process that was launched. And unfortunately, it's the most controversial issue to start with, whereas you have other entry points which could be you could have far more consensus built upon those in order for you to actually get to the end point of military unification. But if that's your starting point, then that ultimately makes it quite difficult for you to actually make anything really stick. So for instance, the policing, working around reforming the Petroleum Facilities Guard, which there should be, for instance, consensus around in Libya, considering that, at least communally speaking, this is viewed in many ways as Libya's lifeline. Those could be far less controversial issues to tackle. Last but not least, and I think this may be something that we could end on, is that there's a very interesting dynamic which we fail to grasp sometimes, which is an age disparity. The 400,000 that Ranj mentioned, the majority of these are under 30. And the majority of individuals that we engage with are often over 60, over 50, and oftentimes over 60. At least in Libya, they're often over 70 or 80. So there's a problem of, I think, culture within society writ large, but particularly within the security sectors, on how these actors perceive what security means, how it should be enforced, how it should be managed, and how it should be overseen. And until that conversation happens, and this needs to happen society-wide, we're going to always clash, and we're always going to be faced with these hybrid security orders, which will, as long as we see them as problems, we're not going to be able to channel really that reality into something that we can leverage for transitions. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ahmad. I think I'm sure you would agree with me that we couldn't have a better conclusion than that. Of course, all the questions remain open, and it's, I think, an encouragement to continue to work on this issue, at least for us as DCAF, with ISPI and with other partners, but also to continue to engage as organizations, as international actors on these matters in the MENA region. I would like to ask you to join me in thanking this excellent panel. They have all been very good and made my life very easy. And so please join me in applauding them. And thank you very much for listening.